But thank you so much for taking the time out. I've caught the first couple of episodes of Queer for Fear, and I think it's a great documentary.
Have you seen 2 or 3?
I've seen 2 so far.
Okay. I think the
Um,
third one should be available for press.
yes, I think it hadn't popped up just yet, but I mean, a 3-year-old, so
Right. Yeah.
content in it I can't quite watch with her around. So it's what are you watching, mummy? Nothing, go away.
Yes.
But yes, I think obviously Queer for Fear is going on to Shudder. Shudder has got this this really good ethos with especially the documentary series that it's doing. You know, there was the Black Noir series,
Yeah.
and
Horror
now,
Noire.
yeah, and then now with the Queer for Fear, they seem very up for helping, you know, represent marginalized voices and getting these people heard. You know, at what stage did you get involved with this project, and why was it so important to you that it got made?
I got involved sort of in situ, like it was underway, and the origin of the documentary. Phil Nobile, who produced Horror Noire with Ashley and Tanana-Reeve, really wanted to do a queer angle to horror stories. And so, and he's a straight ally, and felt that it was important to tell these stories from, you know, to share the resonance of why these stories are so important for queer audiences or marginalized people, and in whatever way they are marginalized. And so it started with him, and he took it to Shudder, and it was developed as a movie like Horror Noire, and then it evolved, you know, that like it became so clear that the history was very complex and multifaceted, and that there are many different letters of the LGBTQ alphabet that have different perspectives and different points of view on all of these horror stories. So it seemed clear that it was impossible to contain it within like a 90-minute movie. And even this first season of Queer for Fear as the documentary is really about the foundations of it. Like, we don't get into a lot of stuff that's post 70s, you know, because there's so much before then, from Gothic literature through filmmakers like F.W. Murnau and James Whale and Alfred Hitchcock that were either queer or had queer sensibilities or queer leanings, but also enjoyed working with queer people. So it felt like we could either put on our roller skates and rush through the Louvre, or we could sit in front of a painting or two and have a conversation about them. And so that was the creative choice that took us from being a movie into a TV series. And then as the TV series evolved, it became clear that we once again we couldn't cram everything into 90 minutes, and we certainly couldn't, you know, and we found that we also couldn't cram it into 4 hours. So it was really about saying, okay, let's tell these chapters of queer horror history as well as we can, and hope that we have the opportunity to continue telling stories, because we've interviewed 100 people. We probably have 3 seasons of material, honestly. And hopefully they'll get a chance to be seen by the audience. So the first season is a very small piece of the pie, and there's a lot more pie to be had.
Yeah, I think it's a nice taster, and I guess to some people an eye-opening one that, you know, shows that there's a lot of things in the media about how horror's become more woke and more political and that, but it's always been that. And I think that is what this film is this series is demonstrating, is that it has always been there. And I think by keeping it sort of more honed in on the early years of cinema, that just proves that point in itself.
Yes, yes, and I think that that was the important first step in the conversation to be had, because there's been a lot of documentaries about modern horror and horror lists, and we see a lot of those documentaries. So for this one, because it was about queer people and the queer perspective, we had to make it for both queer people and cinephiles and straight allies, and also the people that it's going to piss off because the things that they like are going to be foundationally queer, and they're going to have a problem with that, and that's fine. Let's have a conversation. But I imagine there's going to be a lot of people who are mad that, you know, the monsters that they love have queer origin stories.
Well, I mean, that's obviously on them. I mean,
Yeah.
a good documentary, you know, it needs an interesting subject matter, but it equally needs, you know, interesting subjects to interview and people that have got interesting things to say. How did you, you know, cast the net out and get all these people?
Well, we cast a very wide net. We interviewed, you know, over 100 people, and have lots of hours of of interviews, hundreds of hours of interviews, and so really it was about a combination of film critics and scholars and people who are in the horror genre or affiliated with the horror genre in some way, who either are queer or supportive of queers, like Karin Kusama, who may not identify sexually as queer, but is certainly ideologically queer, and always represents queer characters in her storytelling. So it was really about crafting a kind of Algonquin type of salon where you're hanging out with interesting people who've done interesting things or have interesting opinions on the subject of horror. So you know, they are our Dorothy Parkers for this conversation. So that was also one of the kind of realizations as moving through the documentary and trying to figure out what's the best way to convey this information. And it really started to become a salon style you know, dialogue, you know, hopefully with the audience that's taking away what, you know, these scholars and artists and you know, storytellers have to add to things that may have resonated with you for one reason, but once you understand that the origins of that story are from this place of being othered, then hopefully even people who don't identify as queer can relate to being an other in some situation.
Yeah, I think something that the series highlights really well is that, you know, different people find different ways to find their identities. You know, it's not like there's one character in horror that, you know, suddenly all the queer people identify with. You know, everybody has their own character that they sort of saw and went, oh, I feel what that person's feeling. You know, during their interviews, was there any that sort of surprised you? Was there any that you'd never sort of looked at through those films through like a queer eye before, but then hearing them talk, you then went back and reassessed it?
Yeah, Brianna Venskis in her interview talked about her first queer horror experience being E.T., and which I was like, what? And then I was like, oh my God. The and so much of this is about what you bring to it as an audience member, and the fact that there was, you know, a stranger brought into a child's life, and the relationship is, you know, is a romance. It's not sexualized, but it is romantic, and there's cross-dressing, and there is gender fluidity with ET, and whether or not they are male or female. And as we've discovered, they're neither. They're closer to a plant, according to Steven Spielberg. So all of those things for a young person experiencing ET at an impressionable age will present themselves as queer horror if you're picking up on certain aspects of the storytelling. So that I found was surprising, but then I was like, oh my God, you're right. That's all of those things track. And I think one of my favorite interviews, of course, is with Oz Perkins, because it was so deeply personal. And he'd never shared that aspect of his story or his father's story publicly. So it was an incredible honor to be part of that and to represent that in a way that hopefully will give people a greater understanding of what it was like to navigate those times as a closeted queer actor, and the toll it took on him personally and also with the people in his life. So, you know, oppression is a multi-tentacled thing.
Yeah, I think for me, I love watching a documentary like when I'm cooking, but you know, it's kind of like you say, it's that salon sort of feeling. You know, you're just like having a conversation with your friends almost. But I'm not gonna lie, I did burn a few dinners while I was sort of watching this, because there is so many interesting ideas presented that you know that you see the thing with ET that you've just mentioned, and the you know the personal stories, that it does completely suck you in.
Yeah. Oh, well, good. I'm glad it did. It certainly, you know, for us, you know, looking at the different aspects of the story and having so much to choose from, and how are we going to narrow this down into a focused narrative, was a really complex process because there was so much ground to cover. And, you know, we are all, you know, queer storytellers or we're ally storytellers. We have you know, lots of straight allies working on the show as well. And everybody can relate, whether they identify as ideologically queer or sexually queer. They can relate to these stories and relate to a human history.
Yeah, and you know, I can't speak to you about queer media and not discuss Hannibal.
Oh,
You know, obviously it was going to come up at some point. I mean, what do you think it is about that show that not only captured the audience's attention and imagination, but has kept them so loyal? I mean, even years after it's finished.
I really think that so much of it has been about the Hannibal community providing a safe place for like-minded folks. So it's something that has the popularity of the show and the continued enthusiasm for the show really is a byproduct of a community that was built by a passionate audience who saw themselves in a messy, queer, problematic romance, you know, which is a lot of fun. And we talk about needing positive queer representation, and we do desperately need queer positive representation. But I also like the messy queer villain, and there's something about that is relatable for anybody who might not find themselves represented in other narratives in terms of how they look at romance or how they look at relationships and how complicated and gooey they are actually, when, you know, what's often represented is more heteronormative, relatively rigid dynamics that we're all used to because they've been part of society and culture and storytelling for so long. So when a queer audience, even though they may not be cannibals or they may not be serial killers or any of those things, those cannibals and you know, murderers are expressing a depth of humanity that feels more relatable to them than perhaps you know, a straight white guy on a traditional crime procedural would give them. So I think it's about it being such a weird show about weird relationships, and that just felt infinitely relatable to a lot of queer people.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's as equally to Will and Lecter. It's Alana and Margot. Like, I mean,
Yeah,
and Margot is such a fascinating character. I mean, that's, I mean, Catherine Isabel as well in there. It's great.
they're as important in the narrative as Hannibal and Will. Yes, the show is called Hannibal, and Will is, number one on the call sheet. But the Margot Alana story was something that was really kind of a fascinating journey, because in the novel, the depiction of I was going to say Marlana, of Margot is complicated, and it's also from a certain point of view. And some people would say it's problematic, and some people would say it's just complicated. And so there were certain leaps of the storyline to, there was something about Margot's depiction in the novel, which she was a butch dyke, and had a complicated relationship with her body and her sexuality because of sexual abuses. And for me, that was I wanted to remove the queerness from the abuse,
Yeah,
because it felt like that was saying very explicitly she is a masculine presenting woman because of the abuses, as opposed to that just being a natural state of who she is and what her identity is. And so right or wrong, made the choice to make her more glam, because it felt that was more in the aesthetic of the show. And also, it was a reaction to the depiction of Margot in the book, which left me a little queasy. But I wouldn't trade out Catherine Isabel for anything. But there is an interesting exploration of that story from a butch woman's point of view as well. And I might have done things differently with that sort of awareness. But I was also thinking, like, who's going to, it's awfully fun to dress Catherine Isabel up in Alexander McQueen and in those fantastic outfits. But it's Margot and Alana are, like, if we ever get a fourth season, would be a just as big a part as Hannibal and Will.
well, I'll keep my fingers crossed for the fourth season. But back to sort of my final question, back to Queer for Fear. It lands on Shudder on the 30th. Why should Shudder subscribers seek it out? And even better, why should people sign up to Shudder to watch this?
Well, I think it's going to give a different flavor to horror than what you usually see in these horror documentaries. They're, with the exception of Scream Queen, My Nightmare on Elm Street, the Mark Patton documentary, which I have great affection for, there's not a lot of queer content. And so I feel like, because horror is so foundationally queer, that even if you're not a queer person, it would be helpful to absorb this documentary and what it's going to say, because it will give you a greater infinity for queer culture, and also the aspects of your own identity that may feel othered or not represented in society. And I feel like there's something new about all of this old information told in this way that allows us to understand horror stories from a brand new point of view, or a point of view that has been freshened up from how we usually see horror. And I think it's, if this has whetted your appetite for the queer history of horror storytelling, we've only scratched the surface in these 4 episodes. We've got at least 2 more seasons of material that we could be exploring. So if you want more, you have to subscribe to Shudder and make change the algorithm of how they track their audiences so that they see that queer content is something that their audience is interested in, and you'll get more queer content and you'll get more Queer for Fear.
Nice. Well, I wish you the best of luck with the film, with the series, and I really hope that we do get to see the continuation of the history, because it's fascinating.
Thank you, Kat. I'm glad that you enjoyed it, and check out episode 3. It should be up.